Have you ever heard of a case in court that is so bizarre, so utterly unbelievable, that it causes you to pause and think twice? Consider the following scenario. Rome is in the year 897. The streets are alive with gossip. The air is heavy, and a group of priests and officials are about to do something that has never been done before in a solemn church-turned courtroom. The doors creak open, and a procession of a corpse, clad in frayed robes and held by shaking hands, enters instead of the living defendants. This is real history, but it sounds like something from a horror book. Not just any individual, but the former head of the Catholic Church is at the center of this affair. Pope Formosus, who is about to stand trial in front of an audience that is in shock, is the dead man being brought in. Why would anyone put a dead man on trial? You may be asking yourself, that's the big question then. But let's take a moment to visualize the scene before we dive into the whys and hows. The distinction between respect and disgrace is blurred in Rome at this time, a city where power can shift rapidly. The cathedral is crowded this morning, not with worshippers, but with people who are excited to see a show. They are here to witness what may be the most bizarre court case in history, not to pray. The body of Formosus is positioned in a chair, clothed in papal vestments, and held up to face the sitting pope, Stephen VI, who sits in judgment in the flickering candlelight. Even those present must have questioned whether they were dreaming, because this moment is so strange. You don't see a trial for a dead pope every day, after all. However, this is precisely what took place, and the underlying tale is as convoluted as any political scandal you can think of. Even death was insufficient to put an end to a feud in Rome, because of the extreme tensions and profound divisions. The people in that church were going to see a public reckoning that would reverberate for centuries, in addition to a trial. Just wait. The Cadaver Synod is in a class by itself if you believe that the contemporary world has witnessed some bizarre courtroom dramas. Let us take a moment to learn more about the key players who made this strange courtroom drama into one of the most bizarre incidents in church history. Long after his last breath, who was the man wearing faded papal robes and sitting rigidly in the chair? Who was the Pope overseeing this somber process, intent on making a statement regardless of how disturbing it might be? We must meet Pope Stephen VI, the accuser, and Pope Formosus, the accused, in order to truly comprehend what transpired in Rome on that day. Formosus was no ordinary pope. He had spent decades advancing through the church's ranks, making both allies and foes. His journey to become pope had not been easy. From the start, Formosus was entangled in the web of power struggles and politics that shaped the church and its relationship with the European rulers. He gained a reputation as a cunning leader and a divisive figure due to his choices to back some kings over others, or to switch between church positions. Formosus left behind a complex legacy by the time of his death in 896, one that sparked strong feelings among many Romans. Pope Stephen VI sat on the opposite side of the courtroom. Unlike Formosus, Stephen had just assumed the papal throne, but he quickly established himself. Rival groups fought for control of the church and the city of Rome itself during the period he came to power, which was marked by extreme instability. The influential Spoleto family, who believed that Formosus had wronged them, contributed to Stephen's ascent. Stephen swiftly took action to reverse many of his predecessors' decisions with their support. However, Stephen continued for reasons that historians are still baffled by. Something that would erase Formosus' memory and send a message to anyone who dared to cross him was what he wanted: something more dramatic. Here are our two main characters: a living pope who was determined to make amends for past wrongs, and a deceased pope with a troubled past. Bishops, priests, and other officials crowded the courtroom, each with their own fears and allegiances. Others might have viewed Stephen as their ticket to power, while others might have backed Formosus throughout his life. However, everyone's attention was focused on the gruesome scene that was taking place in front of the church that day. The stakes were higher than anyone in that room could have ever guessed, and the tension was high. You could practically feel the weight of history bearing down on you as the trial was about to start. What was meant to be a house of worship had turned into a revenge theater. The odd image of a corpse sitting in judgment served as a potent reminder that church politics could go well beyond the grave in this day and age. This was obviously not merely a personal grudge. Rather, it was a struggle for control of the churches and eventually Rome's own story. The stage was set for one of the most memorable trials in history as the audience silently watched. It is reasonable to wonder why anyone would go to such lengths to try a corpse at this point. Why would the current pope dig up his predecessor and try him in front of Rome's nobles and clergy? As odd as it may sound, the answer is found in the complex web of rivalries and church politics that characterized this time period. The papacy in the late 9th century was about more than just faith. It was also about alliances, power, and who controlled Rome. Furthermore, even the deceased could be used as pawns in the games of the living in this world. Throughout his life, Pope Formosus had become deeply embroiled in political conflicts that extended well beyond the boundaries of the Vatican. He had made strong enemies along the way by supporting some kings and nobles against others. He was viewed by some as a reformer, and by others as a cunning man who would stop at nothing to further his own agenda. His legacy was far from resolved when he passed away. While his enemies, particularly those in the Spoleto family, who had lost their position of authority as a result of Formosus' choices, sought retribution, his supporters wished to preserve his reputation. For Pope Stephen VI, who owed his ascent to those same rivals, bringing Formosus to trial was about more than just making amends. The idea was to boldly declare that no one was above the law, not even the Pope. However, there was another factor involved as well. The distinction between spectacle and justice could be extremely blurred in medieval Europe. Trials were used to establish authority and show those in charge, not just to determine guilt. Stephen VA was essentially rewriting history in front of everyone when he put the Formosus corpse on trial. He wanted to make it very evident to his opponents that you could lose your reputation and even your eternal rest if you made a mistake. The goal of the entire event was to make amends and influence the church's future. It was staged for maximum impact and served as both a warning and a performance. Of course, the concept of a corpse on trial seems ridiculous to modern eyes. However, it wasn't as unrealistic as it seems given the circumstances of the time. Political life revolved around the church, whose rites frequently made it difficult to distinguish between the living and the dead. Stephen V was appealing to people's deepest anxieties and convictions regarding legitimacy, authority, and the afterlife by exhuming Formosus and rendering a posthumous judgment. The trial was primarily about power, who had it, who desired it, and how far they were prepared to go to maintain it rather than real justice. It became evident that this was more than just a personal grudge as the audience leaned forward to watch what would happen next. It was about legacy, control, and the extent leaders would go to in order to influence the history of their era. Even the grave provided no reprieve from the politics of Rome in this peculiar period of history. The scene inside the church was eerily unsettling as the trial began. Instead of being a grand hall, the courtroom was a hallowed place that had been turned into something icy and unrecognizable by rivalry and rage. When Pope Formosus's body was exhumed from its final resting place, it was once more clothed in papal vestments, which were once associated with respect and authority. They appeared out of place now, drooping loosely on a frame that was no longer able to accommodate them. At the front of the church, the body was propped up for everyone to see, sitting on a throne. Bishops, priests, and interested bystanders waited in tense silence as candles flickered uncertainly and shadows danced on the stone walls. The way the living treated the deceased as though he could still be held accountable for his deeds was possibly the most disturbing aspect. The proceedings were presided over by Pope Stephen VI, who had a determined, possibly angry, expression on his face. Everyone in the room knew he was there to make a point. He was accompanied by a deacon who was obviously anxious about the odd and awkward task of protecting Formosus. The deacon was defending a body that had already started to deteriorate and was unable to protest or defend itself, not a living man. It must have been tense, a moment of silent fear. Attendees probably experienced a mixture of surprise and interest. People whispered to one another, looking from the living pope to the dead body in the chair, because it wasn't often that you see a corpse on trial. Something darker, almost theatrical, took the place of the church's customary reverent atmosphere. The trial was more about putting on a show than it was about discovering the truth, demonstrating that Stephen VI had the authority to judge people who believed they were out of his reach. The charges against Formosus were read out loud as the trial got underway. In the huge church, every word seemed to reverberating off the stone walls and settling among the people. There was a lot of excitement in the room as everyone wondered how far this odd ritual would go. The entire event, which combined performance, punishment, and spectacle, was both frightening and engrossing. At that time, the church served as a venue for one of the most peculiar and unforgettable trials in history, in addition to being a place of worship. The atmosphere in the church seemed to get even heavier when it came time to formally lay out the charges against Pope Formosus. Although the charges were read aloud with considerable fanfare, everyone understood that the purpose of the ceremony was to settle political and personal grievances. Formosus was primarily accused of breaking canon law by holding multiple positions as bishop at the same time. Church regulations at the time were clear. No one was to hold the position of bishop of two dioceses, in part to avoid the power struggles that had led to this peculiar situation. However, the charges did not end there. During his pontificate, he was also charged with lying and violating a number of church regulations. Each accusation was specifically designed to undermine any credibility he may have had. The most peculiar aspect of all was that a man who was no longer able to defend himself was the target of these accusations. Rather, the deacon who was supposed to represent Formosus sat clumsily, perhaps wishing he could be somewhere else. All eyes would turn from the living to the dead, from the Pope in judgment to the Pope in the chair, each time a new charge was read. The scene was as disturbing as it was purposeful. Formosus's choices, appointments, and even blessings were now formally questioned, and Stephen VI and his allies wanted to make that very clear. It may have appeared to viewers as a combination of ritual and theater. Every charge was directed not only at Formosus, but also at his supporters, the bishops he had chosen, and the laws he had established. Stephen V was sending a message to the entire church hierarchy by making these charges public. Loyalty could be risky, and even loyalty to a pope did not ensure safety after death. The accusations served as a means of upending the church's leadership and authority, as well as attacking Formosus's memory. The silence in the church must have been deafening as the list of accusations came to a close. The public spectacle of reading these charges over a corpse made it obvious that this was about much more than one man's alleged mistakes, but no one had any doubts about how the trial would conclude. It was a dark chapter in the lengthy history of the Pope, a warning and a power struggle. Everyone in attendance could already see the verdict coming because of the weight of each accusation hanging in the air. As the charges loomed, focus shifted to defense, or rather, the absence of any real defense. The deacon, who had been selected to speak on Formosus's behalf, sat clumsily next to the body, aware that there was little he could do to alter the situation. Defending a man who was no longer able to respond to inquiries, explain his decisions, or even show regret was an impossible task. With every move predetermined before the trial even started, it felt less like a quest for the truth and more like a meticulously planned ritual. The deacon's function was more ceremonial than utilitarian. There was no real expectation that his words would influence anyone, even if he silently recited the standard responses or made courteous denials. It had been decided long before Formosus's body was dug up that he was guilty. Everyone involved saw the defense as merely another aspect of the show, something that was necessary to maintain appearances, but had no real bearing on the result. With a mixture of discomfiture and resignation, the audience, which included church officials, interested bystanders, and possibly a few anxious Formosus supporters, watched this portion of the events. The realization that the trial was never truly about justice, at least not in the modern sense, was what made this scene especially unnerving. It was intended to demonstrate who was in charge, and to demonstrate that no amount of death could shield a person from the repercussions of betraying the wrong people. Despite his best efforts, the deacon could not stop what was about to happen. His remarks were essentially a formality, a little digression before the inevitable conclusion. The tension in the church only slightly decreased as the defense came to an end. There was no tension or doubt about what would occur next. Even those who might have sympathized with Formosus realized that nothing could alter his fate at this point, because the trial was proceeding quickly toward its predetermined verdict. In addition to being extremely unnerving, the sight of a deceased pope being tried and condemned in front of his former colleagues demonstrated the extent to which Pope Stephen VI was prepared to go in order to maintain his own power. Tradition and justice had been supplanted in this courtroom by a display of force, and the defense was merely a reminder of the accused and his supporters' actual helplessness. When the decision was made, nobody there was shocked. Pope Stephen VI found Formosus guilty following the accusations and the flimsy defense. There was never any question about the result. The trial had never been about evaluating the evidence or trying to find the truth, but rather about displaying authority and making a statement. A sense of finality descended upon the room as the decision reverberated throughout the church. This was not merely the condemnation of a deceased pope, but also a warning to anyone who might doubt the new system. Even for a corpse, the sentence itself was startlingly severe. Formosus's actions as pope were all deemed invalid by Stephen VI. As if he had never served as pope, this meant that all of his appointments, decrees, and blessings were now formally revoked. However, the penalty wasn't over yet. Stephen VI ordered the body to be stripped of its papal vestments in front of everyone, a move intended to further degrade Formosus. Once representing the pinnacle of spiritual power, the robes were removed from the deceased and thrown away. The most unsettling aspect then occurred. Formosus's right hand's 3 blessing fingers were severed, a symbolic act intended to nullify the holy deeds he had carried out throughout his life. This ritual was both eerie and memorable for those who witnessed it. The fact that someone who had once been regarded as the head of the church was stripped of their dignity made it abundantly evident that no one was above punishment, not even the former pope. To ensure that there was no remnant of Formosus's influence, the corpse was mutilated in order to eradicate his spiritual authority. Even though it was performed on a dead body, it was a highly symbolic act that must have chilled everyone in the room. After the sentence was executed, Formosus was removed from the official record of church leaders when Stephen VI proclaimed his pontificate to be void. The body, now disgraced and disfigured, was taken out of the church as the last act. Such a sentence was devastating in a society that took the afterlife and the soul's legacy very seriously. The message was unmistakable. Even the dead could not evade the living pope's absolute authority. This trial's conclusion was a calculated move against anyone who might disagree with Stephen VI or doubt his legitimacy, in addition to being a personal jab at Formosus. It demonstrated the extent of Rome's power struggle and the brittleness of the distinction between honor and disgrace, even for those who held the papal crown. There was still one more startling chapter in this tale after the verdict was rendered and the sentence was executed. The court was unsatisfied with just letting the matter rest after removing the papal garments from Formosus's body and amputating the fingers he used to bless the faithful. The public disposal of the disgraced pope's body was the last act in this gruesome spectacle. Instead of burying Formosus in his grave, Stephen VI had the disfigured body thrown into the Tiber River, which was intended to remove not only his legacy, but also his presence from the city he had once ruled. This was a shocking sight to the people of Rome. Imagine the former pope, now devoid of all office-related symbols, being carried out of the church and given a final tour of the streets. A man who had once been in charge of the Catholic Church was no longer respected or treated with dignity. Rather, his body was viewed as a source of disgrace and contempt. Throwing Formosus into the river was a last, public declaration as much as a way to get rid of a body. It conveyed to anyone who might still be on his side, or who doubted Pope Stephen VI's legitimacy, that the opposition would not only be vanquished, but completely eradicated. Even in a city used to spectacle, the Tiber, which meandered through the center of Rome, had seen its fair share of history, but this particular moment stood out. Formosus's body was disposed of in a symbolic and useful way. It was intended to guarantee that there would be no shrine, no tomb, and no location for followers to assemble in remembrance of him. It was an attempt to completely erase him from the Church's history, as though the current of the river could sweep his pontificate away. At the same time, everyone who saw the spectacle was changed by it. In the minds of those in attendance was the image of a dead pope, chastised and cast aside. The final disposal and the ceremonial humiliation demonstrated that power struggles in Rome could go to the utmost extremes. Historians continue to view this event centuries later as a reminder of the extent of church politics and how the desire for power could triumph over even the most fundamental regard for the deceased. Although Formosus' trial was over, the city and the church itself were only now starting to feel the effects of it. However, Formosus's body floating down the Tiber was not the story's conclusion. The cadaver synod's aftermath was actually nearly as dramatic as the trial itself. The response was quick and strong as news of what had transpired swept across Rome and beyond. Stephen VI had sparked indignation and horror among the clergy, nobility, and common people rather than burying the past. People talked in whispers about what they had seen, and many were deeply troubled by the extent their leaders would go to in order to make amends. Stephen VI was immediately criticized. The trial went too far for many Romans, even in the tumultuous realm of medieval politics. It seemed excessive and even sacrilegious to publicly humiliate a deceased person, particularly one who had occupied the highest spiritual position. One supporting bishop started to doubt Stephen's wisdom, and opponents who had been silent now had a voice. Church leaders from all around Europe denounced the trial, describing it as a damaging precedent for the future and a stain on the papacy's reputation. Soon after, there were riots in the streets of Rome as irate mobs demanded that Stephen VI's rule end. The cadaver synod spectacle had failed miserably. Instead of strengthening his position of authority, Stephen had become more reclusive, and his grip on the Pope started to wane. Fearing that his actions had irreparably tarnished the Church's legitimacy, the same political forces that had propelled him to prominence now turned against him. Stephen VI was imprisoned by his adversaries within a year. Shortly after, he passed away in his cell. Some claim he was murdered, while others claim he committed suicide, leaving a legacy shaped by this one notorious deed. Formosus's supporters, meanwhile, discreetly pulled his body out of the river and reburied it according to the correct procedures. In an odd turn of events, succeeding popes would overturn Stephen's rulings, deeming the cadaver synod void and adding Formosus's name back to the list of recognized popes. Although the Church made an effort to move on, the memory of that strange trial persisted. It turned into a warning about the perils of allowing ambition and hatred to triumph over justice and custom. The backlash against Stephen VI demonstrated that, despite a history of violent power struggles, there were some boundaries that the public would not accept being crossed. The cadaver synod came to represent excess and a reminder that sometimes the cost of pursuing power was too great for anyone to bear. Rome and the Church were left to deal with the fallout from a trial that had gone far beyond anyone's wildest expectations. The fall of Stephen VI and the reinterment of Formosus were not the only outcomes of the cadaver synod. The events that transpired in that Roman church became a warning story that reverberated over time as a clear illustration of how far power struggles could go awry. The trial's events rocked the Catholic world, and for decades afterward, people talked about that strange occasion when a pope publicly exacted revenge on his deceased predecessor. Future church leaders' perspectives on authority, justice, and the perils of unbridled ambition were influenced by it. The church made a concerted effort to disassociate itself from the Cadaver Synod in the months and years that followed. Subsequent popes worked to bring order and dignity back to their position. They tried their best to remove the stain left by the spectacle, reaffirmed Formosis's authority as pope, and undid the actions of Stephen VI. As if to demonstrate that some degree of respect could be restored even after such disgrace, Formosus was given a proper burial and the official records were subtly changed. However, it was hard to forget the day a corpse was tried. For the people who lived in Rome at the time, the Cadaver Synod turned into a sinister legend that was discussed among both citizens and clergy. It demonstrated how internal church strife could occasionally surface in unexpected ways. The Synod also turned into a cautionary tale about the value of humility and self-control in leadership. Many people believed that Stephen VI had gone too far in his willingness to degrade the dead for political purposes, demonstrating that even the most powerful people could lose everything if they allowed their personal grudges to control their behavior. For centuries, historians have struggled to understand what pushed Stephen VI to such extremes, and why so many people were willing to comply with the Cadaver Synod. According to some, it reflects the turmoil and instability of the era, when the Pope was torn between rival families and factions, and survival frequently hinged on audacious, occasionally risky actions. Others see it as a singular, profoundly human event in which fear and ambition clashed in a way that would forever alter the course of church history. Regardless of its interpretation, the Cadaver Synod continues to rank among the most peculiar events in the history of the Pope. It acts as a reminder that individuals in charge of institutions, no matter how revered or well-established, shape them. And that occasionally, those individuals have the power to make choices that, when viewed through the prism of history, seem nearly unthinkable. The trial of a deceased pope serves as evidence of how uncertain and occasionally unsettling history can be. Rome was in shock following the turbulent Cadaver Synod. Already accustomed to political intrigue and shifting alliances, the city was caught up in something that was both unprecedented and extremely unnerving. Pope Stephen VI's actions sparked an immediate and extensive backlash that affected everyone in society, from common people to church leaders. Many were astounded that the papacy, an office supposed to foster unity and spiritual guidance, had instead turned into a platform for such a hideous act of rivalry and retaliation. Stephen VI soon found himself the object of derision and indignation. Priests and bishops who had observed or taken part in the trial started to wonder if they had overreached themselves. Following the trial, there were rumors of bad omens, failed harvests, and unrest, and clergy members discussed the violation of the church's sanctity. Rome's populace, many of whom already disapproved of the church's political scheming, now publicly vented their ire. As people demanded accountability and answers, riots and protests erupted in the streets. Even for a drama-loving city, the sight of a pope putting a corpse on trial was too much. Stephen VI soon found himself isolated as a result of the intense backlash. His supporters, particularly the political families who had aided in his ascent, began to turn away out of fear of joining in his shame. As its leaders frantically attempted to regain some semblance of credibility and order, the church was plunged into chaos. Stephen VI's reign was brief in this climate of escalating animosity. After being taken into custody by his adversaries, he mysteriously passed away in prison a year after the Cadaver Synod. Some thought he committed suicide, while others claimed he was strangled. In any case, his abrupt downfall demonstrated how badly the trial had gone wrong. Formosis's followers, meanwhile, quietly sought to restore their lost honor. In an attempt to end the public humiliation he had endured, they retrieved his body from the river and set up a respectable funeral. Popes swiftly distanced themselves from Stephen VI's actions by reviving Formosus' reputation and deeming the cadaver synod void. The Church made an effort to move on, but it was difficult to repair the harm. The trial's story stuck in people's memories, serving as a reminder of the perils of unbridled power and the unforeseen repercussions of allowing private grudges to influence public affairs. Ultimately, the opposition to the cadaver synod marked a sea change for both Rome and the Church. It created a fresh understanding of the necessity of justice and moderation, even during intense political conflicts. Everyone, including clergy and lay people, had learned from the strange trial that there were boundaries to what the public would tolerate, and that some boundaries could never be crossed again. As the world observed and reflected, the Church was left to face the lessons learned from that troubling chapter. As one of the most peculiar and sobering events in the lengthy history of the Pope, the Cadaver Synod left a legacy that has reverberated over the ages. The trial's memory persisted in Rome and throughout Europe in the years and decades that followed, influencing the views of both public figures and common citizens regarding the Church, justice, and power. The tale of a pope bringing his deceased predecessor to trial could not be easily forgotten or removed from history, despite subsequent popes' efforts to restore order and restore the office's reputation. This incident turned into a potent warning about the perils of allowing political aspirations and personal grudges to triumph over custom, decency, and basic humanity. In addition to being a humiliation for the Pope, the Cadaver Synod served as a reminder that the Church was a human organization and that people could let their disputes get out of hand. The Catholic Church's leaders grew increasingly circumspect in the ensuing years, fearing that if they overreached their power, the public would turn against them. Clerics and academics recounted the Synod's infamous events as a warning, urging future generations to take note of the mistakes made in the past. This incident has frequently been viewed by historians as a watershed, a time when the boundaries of papal authority and the significance of accountability were made painfully evident. Although the Synod did not immediately enact broad reforms, it did make the Church face the repercussions of its own behavior and acknowledge that moderation is necessary, even during turbulent political times. The strange trial of Formosus eventually ceased to be a scandal and instead served as a warning about what might occur when rivalry and ambition trumped solidarity and deference. The Cadaver Synod demonstrated to Rome and the larger Church that history is full of erratic and occasionally unsettling events, episodes that call into question our moral vision and serve as a reminder of the human weaknesses that lie at the core of even the most powerful organizations. Although centuries have gone by, the trial's memory is still a clear illustration of the extent of power struggles and the significance of leaders, keeping in mind the lessons of justice and humility. The tale of the Cadaver Synod continues to arouse interest and skepticism today, prompting us to consider the complex interrelationships among history, faith, and power. It lives on not only as an odd anecdote, but also as a reminder that even the most unexpected things can have a profound effect, influencing the direction of organizations and the opinions of those who depend on them for direction. We are still fascinated, cautioned, and reminded of the value of learning from the past by the trial of Pope Formosus's corpse.